After correcting the United States growth figures for the third quarter of the year, it has been revealed that the world's largest economy has not grown at a rate of 4.9%, but 5.2%, while inflation has shown signs of approaching the Federal Reserve's target of 2% annually and employment remains below 4%. Has Jerome Powell achieved the highly unlikely soft landing he had envisioned when he began to confront inflation in 2022? Or is there a part of the story that is not being taken into account? Today we will analyze the statements that the President of the Federal Reserve gave recently, his reading of the economy, and what could come in the coming months for the country. For many, Jerome Powell is on top of the world right now. The U.S. economy is growing at a rapid pace, inflation is falling, and the country is at full employment. Making his initial stumble, where he dismissed inflation as transitory, a thing of the past without significance. However, Powell is cautious about celebrating, because all this data, which seems to show excellent news, is not as good as it might superficially seem. As the President of the Federal Reserve, Powell must fulfill the dual mandate of this institution, which is to pursue full employment and price stability, meaning a dynamic economy with the lowest possible inflation. To achieve this goal, the Federal Reserve relies on interest rates and control of the money supply as its primary tools to find the optimal balance between these two objectives. A rate hike can control inflation, but at the expense of reducing economic dynamics, leading to decreased consumption and employment. Conversely, a rate cut can stimulate the economy but may lead to increased inflation. However, despite successfully bringing down inflation, measured by the variation in a basket of goods and services or consumer price index, the growth rate in the third quarter of 2023 was 5.2%, while unemployment stood at 3.9%. This seemingly indicates that as interest rates rose, growth increased without adversely affecting employment. This is certainly unusual, so what is the explanation?
The U.S. federal budget, is on an unsustainable path, meaning that the debt is growing substantially faster than the economy, which in the long run is by definition unsustainable.
It is possible to attribute what is happening in the American economy to the debt of this country. Debt, by its nature, allows us to bring from the future to the present and commit future income to be enjoyed today. Debt can be productive, where it is invested to generate more income in the future as a form of leverage, or unproductive, implying that today's consumption will result in lower future consumption due to debt repayment and interest. This is relevant to the current situation, firstly because the government's debt has grown unproductively. The government has increased its spending significantly in recent years, and this spending has added to the growth of the economy, and at the same time, much of it has gone to individuals through subsidies that began during the pandemic, thus fueling consumption, another major growth factor. However, as seen in the relationship between the size of the economy and debt, this has not been a productive use of money, as this ratio still remains well above pre-pandemic levels. Secondly, the post-pandemic rebound, which, unbelievably, still has an impact. Thanks to the substantial amount of money given to Americans through various subsidies during the pandemic, they accumulated significant savings, enabling them to maintain high levels of consumption despite the Federal Reserve's interest rate hikes. This has also distorted the labor market, where participation has not yet returned to pre-2020 levels because some people have been able to sustain themselves with savings. But Powell is the first to acknowledge several problems in this context. The first point is related to the unsustainability of the current deficit and the high costs of debt. This will lead to a reduction in government spending, compromising the country's growth in this component, but that's not all.
People couldn't spend money on trips and, restaurants and bars and things like that because it was COVID. Everybody was staying home, so they saved money. And also the government gave checks to people to sort of make them whole and replace their lost income and that kind of thing. So particularly people who were income constrained had much larger piles of savings than they had before the pandemic. And there was always this thought that would get spent down, and so this very strong spending we had in 21 and 22 would ultimately go away. What's been amazing is how strong consumer spending has continued to be, and it may well be. You see credit card borrowing going up, you see defaults going up now. So we may be actually getting to the end of that.
Powell recognizes that increases in credit card debt and increases in defaults are a sign that the savings that Americans had, thanks to the subsidies provided in the pandemic, are running out, and therefore consumption could begin to decline after having been the main driver of growth in the third quarter of the year. This, added to the reduction in government spending, could have a strong effect on growth, while at the same time there is an increase in unemployment. When people are forced to re-enter the workforce because they no longer have savings or access to government subsidies.
As the economy appears to be slowing this quarter, we think it's quite early in the quarter to be able to say that, but we think the third quarter was very, very strong GDP. We think it's slowing now based on the limited data that we have, and all forecasters basically are saying that it will be. We're looking to see how much slowing there is. 70% of the U.S. economy roughly is consumer spending, and so that's going to be the big thing.
Although Powell only has preliminary data on the economic behavior that has occurred in the fourth quarter of the year, everything seems to indicate a slowdown, and it is not clear how severe it will be. What is clear is that the American economy has taken a lot from the future to show apparent growth and prosperity today. And an inflationary episode that was widely compared to that of the 1970s ended up showing great differences, not in terms of the policy implemented by the Federal Reserve, but by the government, which preferred to grow today and worry about the future later, instead of facing a strong crisis at the moment, as happened in the 70s, but giving the economy a solid foundation of stable prices and a strong dollar for the future. Given all these factors, despite the U.S. economy demonstrating considerable resilience, it's not clear whether the price paid for this relative stability will be compensated in the long run. Regarding inflation, Powell has been clear that he will not make decisions lightly and will continue monitoring new reports to avoid repeating past mistakes of lowering interest rates too soon. But if a stronger than expected slowdown occurs, it is difficult to conceive a scenario where drastic measures would not be taken, involving rate cuts and potentially restarting the money printing machine. Regarding all this, I ask you, do you think Powell will be remembered as a hero or villain throughout history? I would like to know your opinion. And if you want to know more details about the third quarter growth in the United States, I recommend that you watch this video next.